Last week's re-election of President Mahmoud Ahmadinejad, Iran's been rocked by mass demonstrations. This marks the most serious internal unrest the country has seen since the Islamic Revolution in 1979. Our next guest took part in that revolution. Payman Vahabzadeh is an assistant professor at the University of Victoria. He joins us from Vancouver. So, Payman, can you describe for us your experience of protesting in the streets in 1979?
Well, from what I can recall, from the eyes of the 17-year-old that I was back then, 30 years ago, what I remember is that we went out to the streets with a certain sense that we might not come back. So we were filled with fear because we were up against the behemoth, so to speak. Having said that, we also felt that we were part of something larger than life, and as the movement continued, we realized that we were really up to something great. Now that I reflect back, like 30 years after, as a middle-aged man on that young man's life, I recall that basically that was the moment in my life when I realized that, this trivial individual that I was back then, that I am right now, could be the historic individual and could do, achieve great things. So that's the sensation that I, bring back from, my experience in 1979, 30 years ago.
It's interesting because we've been in contact with some young people, maybe not quite 17, but in their 20s, quite young, who expressed similar feeling. One was in contact with us saying, if I don't come back, please don't forget me. So a true sense of actually this could be a matter of life and death. Do you think that this time around it's much different from 1979?
Well, the movement right now is different and similar to 1979. It's similar in the sense that we were up against a brutal regime. We were up against a regime that did not hide its intention to repress, people's demands and so on and so forth. There's also the similarity that, in terms of street tactics and so on and so forth, there are many similarities. Young people also participated in, to a great extent in 1979. But this movement now is really the movement of young people and women. I cannot emphasize enough the role that women played in this movement. And in fact, women's movement and student movement is the backbone of this movement that we are seeing right now. So this movement has grown out of its sort of constituencies and has become a national movement. And in fact, today is the day that every conscientious Iranian man wishes he were a woman. I cannot emphasize that enough. It's really impressive the role women are playing in this movement. On the other hand, there is also this tendency to sort of fast forward this movement using the sort of blueprint of the 1979 revolution. I cannot tell that this movement will culminate in a revolution. That's yet to be seen. On the other hand, back then in 1979, we were up against a regime that was unified. It was all behind Shah's autocratic rule. But this time around, we are facing a regime that is actually fractured from the inside. And this movement can actually function as a wedge driven into this sort of disintegrating trunk. And as the movement deepens, the ruling elite will fracture and hopefully will split up. On the other hand, given the brutal suppression of the movement yesterday, I must comment that back then in 1979, we were up against a regime, an army basically, and a police force that was made up, of mainly state employees, if you like, and also conscript soldiers. Yesterday's repression was done by Basiji militias, it was done by anti-riot forces, and it was done disturbingly enough by mercenaries that the regime has brought in from its followers in the Middle East region, basically Arab countries.
We're almost out of time, but I just want to ask you one last question, because I think this is probably a key difference between 1979 and today, and that's technology. That's the internet. It's YouTube. It's people recording things on their cell phones. And it getting out to the world. What do you think that means in terms of the effects that could have on what happens in Iran?
Yeah, I remember that the technology we used back then was cassette tapes. But nowadays, it's the role of electronic technology, internet, Facebook, Twitter, is immense. So the information can no longer be contained, and therefore it's really hard to contain the movement by depriving it from the information that's needed.
And yet the crackdown still happens. So does that worry you in a sense that even though these images are getting out and this video is getting out, the regime, through the various sources that you've talked about, are still willing to crack down in the eyes of the world?
Well, does that worry me? Yes, indeed, it does worry me. But note that the young men and women that are out in the street, they have the live memory of 10 years ago, the heavy-handed repression of the student movement. So they know what they are up against, and so far they seem undeterred. But we will see change of tactics. Probably this movement has been mainly a nonviolent movement. So we will have to see a change of tactics so that people will achieve what they want, hopefully through less human cost.
Heyman, good to speak to you today. Thank you very much.
Thanks so much, Andrew.